Okay, welcome to Hardfire Media Liberal Conversations. This is a series of screen media programs we're doing and have been doing over the last 6 months during in the United States, the national emergency, quote unquote. Never let a good crisis go to waste. So as long as we have this national emergency, we'll continue having these liberal conversations. The idea behind liberal discussions comes from classical liberalism, which is based on free speech, freedom of religion, and equal rights under the law. We've made about, this will be our 12th or 13th Hardfire liberal conversations session. And prior to that, we've made about 40 TV shows at the studio in downtown Brooklyn, which is now locked down, except for those that work there. So my name is Cameron Weber. I'm an economist and historian and the producer of Hardfire for about the last 5 years. Tonight, I look forward to this show. Today, we're going to address the question, does government debt matter? So now we'll introduce everyone. We'll just go in counterclockwise, at least from my screen. So Francisca, Dr. Aldape, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Well, I studied economics at the New School, and that's where I know Cameron. And I've been also participating and talking with Greg, Ron, and now with Matthew has been very interesting. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Francisco's been supercharging teaching this semester, so thank you for taking the time out. And then now we've got Ron Litchman. Ron and I have made several shows together on trade, and we've discussed trade with China quite a bit recently. Ron, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you again from the Catskill Mountains of New York, where I was able to escape the de Blasio regime somewhat, but unfortunately not the Cuomo.
I might have to
good to be with you.
I might have to bleep out the names of the politicians, but we can continue on. And then we've got my friend Greg Smith from Greg. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cameron. How you doing? From Melbourne, Australia here. Again, interested to join in and be part of the conversation, give you a view from the man in the street in Australia as a different perspective. So, yeah, glad to be here.
And Greg was an international businessman, a business person, so he can bring that perspective to us. And then also now we've got new on the program. We've got Matthew Morgan from Brooklyn. Welcome, Matthew.
How's everybody doing? Very nice to be here. Not an economist or finance by trade, not a professional, but it's one of my passions of mine. I host a YouTube show on various topics in regards to the financial markets and economics. So honored to be here with so many esteemed fellow participants and looking forward.
Okay, you froze up for a second there, Matthew. Maybe you'll be able to come back. Okay, so thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for participating. Okay, here we go. Does government debt matter? You might know that the US government debt has increased $3 trillion in the last 6 months with all the bailouts and other US government spending to address the economic lockdown caused by the national emergency and executive orders violating civil and economic rights. This debt increase means government debt is the highest it has been as a percentage of the economy since World War II, and I'm talking about the United States. And importantly, economic growth is less than this earlier period, meaning that debt is growing more quickly than the economy for the first time in the US history, as far as I know. So right now, I wanted to share my screen and show you something that recently came out just today from the General Accountability Office that shows the debt levels. Let's give this a try. Right. So here you can see here's the debt as a percentage of the economy during World War II into the Korean War, and then debt levels after the dot-com boom and bust, and now the debt levels from the housing boom and bust, and now onward into the future, currently in the COVID period. So the reason the GAO does this is because no politicians are addressing it. So I just wanted to prior to the pandemic, the federal debt was about 20 trillion, or about 60,000 per person. Federal government unfunded liabilities for social spending, promises, and government employee benefits are another 200 trillion, or 10 times the accounted for public debt, or about 600,000 per person. So our question is, does this debt matter? Now let's have an open discussion on that. Does the debt matter? So my mom, I invited my mom to the show, but she couldn't. She didn't want. She's too shy, I guess. And she said, yes, it matters because that debt is passed along to her children, meaning me, and to her grandchildren, of which she's got 4. So for her, the debt matters because we're just passing along the spending on to future generations. That's for you, Mom.
Cameron, I would agree with you that well, debt matters. Government debt matters. I think that's how you pose the question.
Yeah.
But to borrow a phrase, I'd say all debt matters. Consumer debt matters, corporate debt matters, and government debt matters. But I also think, in my view, there's good debt and bad debt.
Yeah.
And one can borrow to buy a house because you need shelter and you pay for it out of future earnings. And corporations can buy income producing assets, and the government can, with borrowed money, build hard assets that improve an economy and facilitate commerce and provide necessary infrastructure, and probably and preferably on a scale that private industry can't do. So we have a space program and an internet highway system and a system of air traffic control, which, yes, theoretically, under the Mises school, can be atomized into individual entrepreneurial activities, but practically speaking, probably not. And that I think is good debt. And there is bad debt. Some of that social spending debt that doesn't have much to show for it is like buying your groceries on your credit card and paying 19% for the consumables that are consumed. That's not all the same thing. So when I address your question, does the debt matter? I'd say yes, the debt matters, but it's not inherently either bad or good. There's good debt and there's bad debt.
Right.
Having said all of that, cheaper debt, ceteris paribus, I can say that among economists.
Yeah.
Cheaper debt's better than expensive debt.
Like we have today, easy money for 10 years. Yeah.
Yes. So if the government is a borrower at cheap rates, putting aside the question of whether it can manipulate the system to provide itself cheap rates, or whether it should, it can buy us, the current generation, and future generations, a national wealth of stuff at very cheap prices. So if we go back and look at the New Deal, I know the hated New Deal among some circles, but we have national parks, we have schools are sprinkled all over the country, bought with borrowed money that couldn't be replicated today at almost any cost. The George Washington Bridge and transportation around the country.
Yeah, I wanted to add, right. So my PhD concentration in history was on the New Deal. And prior to the New Deal, you had 90% of infrastructure, bridges, roads, tunnels, sidewalks, sewers. 90% of that was done at a local level, right? And then by the end of the New Deal, it became a federal issue, just like the federal government now is bailing out some cities. So when you get that central planning thing and politicization of the infrastructure spending as opposed to the local level. And at the federal
wholeheartedly agree with you. But the issue there to me is not whether the debt is inherently good or bad, but how is the debt employed and by whom and whether it's accountable. I will carry no portfolio, make no defense for bridges to nowhere.
Do you have government bonds in your portfolio, Ron? No, you don't have to answer. You don't have to answer.
I do have defensively some short-term notes in a ETF.
You're not Ron Paul who keeps everything in gold.
I am not. It's too heavy to carry around.
Right. So thank you, Ron Litchman. Anybody else want to add their comments on does the government debt matter? Ron's talking about how it's applied. And later we'll look at corporatism, is where the state is giving funds to certain large businesses and picking and choosing winners, and how that is politicization today during today's bailouts. But just on the general question, does government debt matter? I'd like to hear from Dr. Aldape, who's a little bit more Keynesian, I believe. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. So I was just reading this article in the Financial Times, since you were bringing attention to the analysis by the, what was the name of the institution?
General Accountability Office.
Accountability, right.
Government Accountability Office.
Government Accountability.
Yeah.
So there is this article that, I would like to share with you. I'll send it in the chat. But essentially, it's, the title is, the IMF is calling on rich nations to boost public investment. Fund downplays debt concerns and calls for infrastructure spending for COVID-19 recovery. And following to what Ron is saying, I feel like debt is not necessarily bad for the reasons that, now, as you were saying, there can be good or bad debt. But I feel that given the situation right now with low interest rates and how many countries are trying to get out of this very difficult situation, right? That this, and this has been going on for a long time. The whole public investment has, for many reasons, I guess, not being kept up as you would normally have. If you look at the U.S. history, right? What happened? Why are not like better infrastructure? I think that was like one big promise like 4 years ago, and as far as I can see, it's only been shows and like a TV reality show, and people like they need some kind of like.
Well, see, the thing is, and that's why I mentioned the decentralized public works spending prior to the New Deal, is because then people had the incentive to maintain their local infrastructure. The way it is done now, it's just a stimulus during the downward portion of the business cycle, a bunch of federal government centrally planned spending that then goes to seed after the federal government money is over, and the local governments get saddled with it. And there was a
right.
Cameron, that's not altogether how it works. If I can harken back to my interim stint at New York City government, yes, there's federal funding and federal grants for what I knew best was sewer treatment plants, but these were locally designed and costed out projects that were deemed to be necessary at the local level. And they were able to be built because there was federal government money behind it. It wasn't the same sort of central planning, or the sort of central planning I think of by that phrase, where Deus ex machina comes around and just drops money hither and yon. There was a considerable local component to the decision-making process.
Yeah, and under the New Deal, they had to participate in the planning and provide 10% of the labor. Or 90%.
And actually some percent of the costs, as I recall. Maybe only 10%, but a percent.
Yeah. Francisco, are you done?
Yeah, but I just wanted to just add to, as you were saying, highlighting, it's important to look at the economic history, but obviously around this time, there were no pandemic around as far as I understand. Well, there was the Spanish flu, right? But even you have like Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell saying that he's almost begging the government to do some kind of assistance, because it's probably better to err on providing more assistance than just to provide the minimum assistance. So
my poor grandchildren are going to be born into more than $600,000 in debt. They're going to be born into $1 million.
If there's a planet, still like assuming 50 years from now, there is still a planet, right?
Something like that. So let's hear from very funny. Yeah, that's part of our liberal discussions is to talk over all this stuff that's going on so we can get some kind of comfort level. And we've covered the protests, we've covered all kinds of crises that we've had here. Greg or Matthew? Matthew, you're new on the show. Why don't you tell us does government debt matter?
Yeah, I'd say in the short term, I don't know how long the short term is. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 20 years, but it obviously doesn't matter. I mean, we are the reserve currency. We can print as much money and go into as much debt as we want because we'll always be able to pay off our debts. And if anybody thinks that in the near term, any other currency is going to take that place, I just don't, I think it's very unlikely. And in the long term, though, it's definitely a problem. Like you said, like near the end of my life, my kid's life, you know, we eventually the reckless money printing will catch up with us. When? I don't know. But it's bitten every other nation in the ass over the past, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 years. So it's coming. And, you know, you can be a Peter Schiff, you can be those guys, Ron Paul, and you can say, it's coming. You can make your career off of it, but none of them know when it's coming. But in the short term, it does have negative effects. I mean, the more that we have in debt, the higher interest that the government and our taxes go towards paying off the interest, which is a short-term effect, and it's a negative one. Like whether you like government or you don't like government, that extra $200 billion that's going towards paying off the now $30 trillion in debt could have gone to social programs. Whether you support them or not, at least that's better than them just going to the Federal Reserve to pay off interest or, you know, bonds or wherever.
Yeah.
So
pay down.
You know,
Matthew, right. The idea behind the world reserve currency, the exorbitant privilege, that's a good one. And I don't know if you're aware, but the Chinese central bank has stopped buying freshly minted U.S. debt. They still hold all the stuff Hank Paulson sold them
right
during the housing back bonds and that, but they're not buying any new debt.
It's because it doesn't pay much in interest.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that is what bites you in the backside, Matthew, eventually on the reverse. And as you pointed out, and wisely, we don't know whether it's today, tomorrow, or 50 years from now. But I dispute with the modern monetary theory folks that we can print money indefinitely at whatever gobs and quantities, and nobody cares. Eventually, the dollar is no longer a desired commodity. It may be the reserve currency, but other countries and investors don't want it as much, and they charge us more for it. And that reduces our standard of living, even though we're a reserve currency. The dollar isn't worth as much because it's so laden with our self-induced debt. So that could eventually happen. I believe, Cameron, you might know more about this than I, and you may well have studied it. I believe that it's a kind of a relative thing, that the United States, the dollar gets away with it for as long as it does because it's the best house in a poor neighborhood. Exactly. And there aren't any other currencies that are more reliable or stronger. So the Chinese are going to take a shot at it, but I don't think the yuan is a contender. So we're getting away with it for now, but that's not inexorable.
I think that's what we've come to a consensus on so far. Greg is lucky he doesn't have troops all over the world. His children, his son is not going to inherit 700 million Australian pounds in debt. You don't have an active central bank. You haven't had a recession in 20 years, and you're going through your first one now. Greg, what do you think? Does debt matter? Government?
Yeah, well, it definitely matters. And it's interesting, Cameron, as I mentioned to you, that the Australian federal budget was handed down on Tuesday night. And normally our fairly conservative governments, whether they're right or left wing, focus very heavily on a balanced budget. And that was often a big piece of news every time it's delivered. And there's all sorts of commentary from business to social groups on whether it's a good or a bad thing. But the numbers here, we blow out on a similar graph that you showed before for the US. But the budget's been received very favourably by business people, social groups, and everyone that has an interest. So people's focus is on what needs to be done to get us out of the current hole we're in, and less about a budget deficit and government debt, which would be a really, really big issue under normal circumstances. So I think what will happen here is it's not the key focus at the moment, but hopefully as things move forward and some of the many very good budget programs here work, then people will start worrying about the debt. So I think it's one of those, it's like a tsunami on the horizon. Everyone knows it's there, but we'll just run around and do all this other stuff first and worry about it when it gets a little bit closer.
Exactly. That's the problem, is people have lost the ability to think about the future.
But wait, I mean, this is the test of trickle down. If it's really going to trickle down, the debt is going to jumpstart an economy, and we're in I think a unique and political, economic, and moral circumstance where this is a worldwide depression that is government induced.
Right.
This is not a business cycle. So governments around the world canceled livelihoods. And there might be some moral equivalent or moral imperative for governments to restore, dare I say, reparations, what they've taken away. Now, and we will test and we will hope that trickle down works. In the great financial crisis, the Ron Pauls of the world and the Rick Santellis of the world were going long in wheelbarrows so they could haul around their overly inflated dollar with visions of the Weimar Republic. Never happened. We did not have runaway inflation.
Well, you know why that is because the digital economy, because the transactions costs are so low now.
Okay.
Just imagine
Good.
how exactly.
Good. It works.
Which brings us to our next point, which is what is seen and what is unseen. So right now, there was a time during the housing bailouts where the central bank was buying more debt than the private markets. In other words, the central bank was buying more debt with their printed money than were the private markets buying US government debt. And so my point about that is that printing money is regressive, because even though you may not see the inflation, things do cost more than they would had there not been that money printing. And the money printing also is channeled into debt and equity and art market increases. So the wealthy who can afford the asset increases and can have more disposable income to buy into the asset markets gain wealth during easy money periods, where those people who have less disposable income have to pay more for their means of existence. So I dislike monetary policy.
I like that.
Because it's aggressive. That's why I don't like.
Okay. Now,
that's right.
If the debt ever has to be repaid, it has to be repaid by taxpayers or by inflation. If it's repaid by taxpayers, that's less regressive, because people who don't have the wherewithal to have any assets are probably not paying taxes. Income taxes. Now they'll pay sales taxes and other sorts of excise taxes if they choose to buy what is taxed. But to that extent, the income tax side, it is less regressive. But let me go back to the what the debt is used for. Historically, it was used for building schools in the New Deal. Those schools are the benefit of rich and poor alike, and they come free to those who would otherwise not be able to own assets and buy their own school or go to a private school. And national parks and other national treasures that I've recalled, but the Louisiana Purchase and Alaska, all of which were, I think, bought with borrowed debt. Let's just suppose nowadays the federal government borrows several billions of dollars and actually invents or discovers a vaccine for COVID. And that is made available to the country, to its population, and the world. That's regressive in reverse. That's a huge benefit at almost no cost to those who are on the bottom of the income ladder.
Good. So we've got 2 minutes left. I just want to say, just take 30 seconds of that and say another thing that bothers me, the way that the debt is being used today, is that it's going to special interest groups, large, well-connected corporations, large, well-connected businesses that are deemed essential. And we've talked about corporatism in this show before, about how that's what Mussolini did. That's when the state picks and chooses winners, and that's what's going on with this debt. So that opens up a big can of worms that we're not going to be able to talk about. So if anybody has wants to wrap up and give us 30 seconds or so of just to kind of wrap things up. Greg and Matthew, you haven't had a chance to say all that much. And Francisco.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick and just say that in the short, like I was saying, in the short term, debt wins you elections, and I think that's why a lot of politicians don't bring up the stuff that Ron was talking about, where in the long run it decreases our standard of living and stuff. So that's not going to win you elections. That doesn't make people feel good. That doesn't make people feel happy. I'm going to buy these things. People are like, well, we can afford these wars, but we can't afford the Green New Deal. We can't afford either of them. Okay. So but nobody wants to hear those because neither of those things make you feel good. So the debt does matter.
Nobody even reads the GAO.
Somebody needs to have the balls to say it.
GAO has been doing that for 30 years, and neither did the Team Red or Blue do anything about it. Francisco, give us some final. How about on the monetary regressive idea? Do you disagree with that? Or?
I think that also, as Ron and Matthew are saying, that the problem is, and as you highlighted, the special interest and how money is not. Maybe it would be very nice if, in fact, we come up with a vaccine, or the government and private companies, and they're able to provide these vaccines to everybody free of charge or not that expensive. But if we have a polarized society right now, you kind of wonder if that's in fact, like the historian Adam Tooze just had recently an article that he was making this point, right? That the vaccine itself can probably divide even more the country and the world. Because if you don't have access to a vaccine that maybe you like cost $1,000 or $2,000, who's going to be able to afford that, right?
The devil's in the detail, Cameron. I noticed in the Australian budget, they factored in a $55 billion benefit on the basis we'll all be vaccinated by this time next year.